And if you don't know what that is, you'll hear a little bit about it today. But if you were here for Amanda Tyler's presentation, you might remember that she had some bar charts which tracked the ways in which people who identify with a particular religious or as well as ethnic groups to which they identify with particular statements that we often associate with Christian nationalism. Well, that survey work, the data that she was using for her presentation, is the work of Robert Jones and PRRI. So it won't surprise you to know that their work is connected. Dr. Jones lives in Washington, D.C., but he is a native of Jackson, Mississippi. And y'all know Lowell Grisham, my predecessor, for whom his time in Mississippi growing up was really formative for his own appreciation for the work of racial healing and the ways in which white supremacy is bound up in the Christian faith, sometimes in ways that we see, but often in ways that we don't. I'm really glad that Dr. Jones is here today to talk a little bit about his book, White Too Long, but more importantly about his own journey and what that has taught him about the relationship between Christianity and white supremacy and what we might do about it. At the end of his presentation, we will have time for question and answer, so save your questions for that. But join me in welcoming Dr. Jones.
All right. Am I on? Yes. All right. Great. Well, thank you. It was great to be here and great to be with some of you yesterday. So I'll try not to completely just repeat what I did yesterday. But I wanted to talk to you today about kind of my own journey, really wrestling with this entanglement of white supremacy and Christianity. And I'll start by just saying a word about white supremacy. I said this yesterday, but I think that word sometimes people who look like me have a little recoiling from that word. And I was going to say a little bit about what I mean by this. You mentioned Amanda Tyler, who's a friend, and I saw her poster on the wall in there, and I'm glad she was here. I'll be actually with her in Texas in just a few weeks for an event with the Texas Tribune. But another fellow traveler of ours, who you may know from MSNBC, Eddie Glaude, who, by the way, is a fellow Mississippian of mine, of the state, and he, I think, gave the best definition of white supremacy that I have seen. And what he calls it is like understanding white supremacy without all the bluster. And what he means by that is to say that most white people, I think, when you hear the word white supremacy, we tend to kind of immediately conjure up this image of a black and white photo. It's probably very old. It's going to be folded and, kind of torn around the edges. And it's of people in sheets, burning a cross, right? So the KKK, that's what we think of with white supremacy. And that, of course, is an expression of white supremacy. But it's also conveniently one that is very distant from most of our day-to-day experiences. And I think that's one of the reasons why that image has some power for us, is because it puts it at arm's length from us. But if we just take the words and we kind of flip them around and get away from the jargon that we attach to the most extreme kind of visual elements like that, then we realize it's very much closer to home. So if we take, instead of white supremacy, we flip it around and we say, what we're really talking about is this idea of the supremacy of white people to other people in the country. And then it becomes, I think, oh, okay, yeah, we know what that is. I gave a talk yesterday at the public library here, and I mentioned there, for example, that if I'd been giving that talk there more than 60 years ago, only white people could have come, right, in that space. That still, in many of our neighborhoods, we still have, even to this day, you yourself may have a deed to your house that has a covenant restriction written into it that the property can only be sold to other white people, even though that's now illegal, but that's still written into the deeds of many, many houses across the country. So that's, you should look that up, because they were living in these kind of red line districts, right, where only white people, reserved for white people. Libraries, pools, schools, all of that, right, reserved, the best of our communities reserved for people who are white. That's just an undisputed part of our history. So it's that kind of thing that I mean when I'm really struggling with what does it mean to be a part of a tradition that has justified that worldview. So now I grew up Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi, for the most part. My people, as we say, are actually further back from Macon, Georgia, in and around kind of Bibb County and Twiggs County, Georgia. But I grew up mostly in Jackson there and as a Southern Baptist. And so our denomination is probably the one, and we may have some, any Southern Baptists in here? Former Southern, there we go, all right. There's my people, all right. So, as you know, that the Southern, right, in Southern wasn't just a compass point. That Southern meant a kind of conviction and an allegiance to a Confederate worldview. And in fact, that split happened in 1845, which was well before the political secession. And when you read the history, the thing I never quite got taught is that the split of the churches, the Methodists, by the way, former Methodists in here? All right, yes. The Methodists, by the way, split the same year, 1845, over the issue of slavery into northern and southern components. And that was the dress rehearsal for the political secession that happens later. So the churches, right, our churches laid the groundwork, right, for that split. And in fact, many of the folks who gathered in Augusta, Georgia, to kind of be the architects of the split with the Baptists were actually in the room in Alabama when the Articles of Secession were written and praying over those things and preaching sermons around and justifying those things. So, like, what does it mean to be a part of a tradition that, has that about it, right? That there was a serious conversation. And in fact, our Southern forebears thought they had the better biblical argument. If you read their kind of sermons, right, around this, that slaves obey your masters, right, and other kind of examples of enslavement in the Bible. So they kind of held on to that. So a lot of my journey has been about trying to make sense of that. And what does it mean? How can I disentangle these clear commitments to white supremacy that were justified by a faith that I inherited, and can I disentangle those things? I mean, I actually came to a point where I had to ask a serious question about whether those things could be disentangled and it still have some integrity to it. Like, would there be anything left if I disentangled those things? So I want to read a little bit of an opening of actually my most recent book, which is called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and a Path to a Shared American Future, because it's kind of part of an arc of a 10-year journey now that I've been on. I'll set the table real quickly. The first book that I wrote in this kind of journey was called The End of White Christian America. It was written in 2016, and it was really about demographic change. And I was really trying to make sense of what I called, or what I kind of only half-jokingly called the Great White Christian Freakout moment in our country that I was seeing happening. And what was going on there. And one of the things I traced in that book was that we were actually experiencing a quite significant demographic change in the country. And that is that white Christians were finding themselves for the first time in the demographic minority in the country. That had never happened before. So just to give you the numbers, in 2008, when our first African-American president was running for office, the country was still comfortably majority white and Christian. We were 54% white and Christian. That is, if you take Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, non-denominational, all of it, 54% white and Christian. During the 8 years that he was in the White House, we actually crossed this threshold, and we went from being a majority white Christian country to one that was no longer a majority white Christian country. It goes from 54% to 47%. Right? So we crossed that threshold while we have our first African American in the White House. And I think that the symbolic thing of having a black man in the White House, right, while we go through this transformation, right, in the country, was just a bit too much for many of our fellow white Christians. And we are still living in the reactivity from that realization in the country. I think that's what's fueling the anger, the fear, the nostalgia. I mean, it's remarkable the number of words that we hear now that have the word "re" in them, right? Reawaken, reclaim, restore, revive, reassert. And don't forget, the last word in that Make America Great Again, right? This is all a hearkening back here that we're kind of just living through here. And so that first book was just trying to get my head around, like, what's going on? Like, why now? And that was kind of trying to lay out the lay of the land there. And I think it is about that demographic change. By the way, that number today, so it went from 54% to 47% from 2008 to 2016. That number today is 41%. So it's continued to drop while the number of unaffiliated Americans are continuing to rise. Like, that's the bookends here. And I should say this, too, that, the Episcopal Church is part of what we sociologists sometimes call the mainline Protestant tradition, right, as opposed to the evangelical Protestant tradition. What's notable is that I think, as I was growing up, all the evangelicals were, and frankly, somewhat with some glee, pointing to all the declining mainline denominations, right, and saying, yeah, that's what happens when you have your liberal theology and all of that, right, you decline. It turns out that over the past 20 years, the group that has declined the most as a percentage of the population is actually white evangelical Protestants. They have gone from being nearly a quarter of the population just by themselves. The last numbers we have from last year are 13. So 25 to 13 over this past. And so that the most precipitous drop has actually been, and they've dropped faster now than the mainline denominations. In fact, today, mainline Protestantism and evangelical Protestantism both comprise 13% of the country, right? So they're the same size now, but mostly because of this steep drop in white evangelicals. So I think part of that is the great white freakout. And then I think even if they don't know the statistics, they do know, white Christians do see things like Spanish language billboards, flipping their AM dial and hearing Tejano music right on the dial, going to the grocery store and seeing an ethnic food aisle in the grocery store, and I think most importantly, looking at the elementary school composition, right, and realizing it's not as white as it used to be in our schools, and you can literally see it if you kind of go to the public school. You can just see the changing in many places, most places in the country, in fact. So I think that's part of it. And then White Too Long, the book I talked about yesterday for the most part, was really my attempt to wrestle with my own family's history. So if that's the kind of freak out moment we're experiencing, how does that work? And so my own kind of delving into my own Southern Baptist roots and using kind of as an icon my own family Bible that I have from 1815 that came down from Virginia to Georgia with my mother's side of the family, and I won't go into it much today, but basically what the objects that I had on my desk at one time were this family Bible that has 4 generations of my family in between the Old and New Testament in those kind of genealogical pages there in that kind of brown oxidized ink, and this is an object of great pride that my family's kind of passed down for 6 generations now, sitting in my study today. And when I was doing genealogical research, coming upon an estate settlement of the namesake of that Bible, and it listed all of their earthly possessions, and among those earthly possessions that it listed were 4 human beings, right, by name, like Sarah, a woman, at $400, Bird, a boy, at $150, and then just listed all the other things on the estate alongside of like things like wagons and mules and sheep. And it, at one point I had both of these documents on my desk at the same time, and just realizing like, what do I do with this, right? That these people who so valued their faith and clearly took it seriously, and I've got Baptist preachers and all of that, like not just lay people in my lineage, but what do I do with the fact that these people, who are my people, also lived their lives this way and saw no contradiction, and in fact sent their sons off to die to defend their right to enslave others based on the color of their skin. Like, that's how much they believed in it. What do I do with that, right? And what do I do with the fact that our church was on the wrong side of segregation in Jackson, Mississippi, right? That when we had one black kid show up to our youth group, it set off an emergency deacons meeting in our little Baptist church to figure out what the hell we were going to do if his family decided to join the church, right? So what do I do with that faith? And then the most recent book was me trying to take the story back a little further and ask the question, like, so where does this come from, right? How far back does this go in American Christianity, particularly in white Christian circles? If I trace the kind of roots back to its most proximate cause, how far back do I get there? And I really came to the conclusion that actually this version of Christianity that had as one of its primary kind of convictions is that these lands were a kind of promised land that were divinely ordained for European Christians and their benefit. That's the version of Christianity that actually lands on the shores. So any version of Christianity that has kind of developed a different kind of road has been fighting with that claim from Christianity, which predates it all. One quick just thing I'll mention here is the inauguration, the most recent inauguration got moved right into the rotunda of the Capitol. And I write about this write about the pictures in the rotunda. Many of you may have been there, but my guess is that you didn't pay that much attention to what the paintings were inside the rotunda. There's 4 of them. And they were commissioned in the mid-1800s to tell the story of America. One of those paintings is Hernando de Soto, standing on the banks of the Mississippi River in 1541 in North Mississippi, not that far from here. And so he is there, and the painting displays him on a big white horse in all his military kind of European finery, and he is pushing into an indigenous village. So he's like storming into the middle of the village. And behind him are all these soldiers. There's a cannon being pushed into the frame. They've got pikes, they've got swords, armor, all of that. And literally their weapons kind of litter the bottom left-hand side of the painting. And then up in the middle and off to the right are all these indigenous people, half-clothed, kind of cowering away from him like this and looking kind of in awe. Their weapons look very primitive, and they're like on the ground. None of them are holding them. And then off to the bottom right-hand corner is this other image, and it is of a giant cross being erected and planted in the middle of this indigenous village. Right? It's like a 20-foot cross, and there's a priest there reading some scripture. And that image, right, it's there. It's one of the 4 paintings inside the rotunda telling the story of who we are and how we got here. Is that claim, right, that these lands were destined to be ours, purely because we understood God to ordain it that way and to kind of reserve them for our own use. And so I really explore that tradition in our country in the most recent book. So I'm going to read just a little bit, and then maybe we'll just take some questions and see where we want to go. But I was trying, in the most recent book, I tried to hold together this history of encounters with people of African descent and this encounter with people, with indigenous people. Because we too often, I think, have those 2 stories in their own little silos, but we don't really read them together. And so in this book, I'm really trying to kind of hold these 2 things together. So this is from the intro to the book, and it just lays out a scene that connects these two histories, and it connects them very much to kind of who we as white Christians are as well. On May 4th, 1863, the steamboat Northerner pushed up the Mississippi River from St. Louis, bound for Fort Snelling, a military outpost north of St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a few miles into the journey, Captain Alfred J. Woods encountered a large handmade raft adrift in the strong currents. Aboard were 76 African Americans, 40 men, 10 women, 26 children. The leader of this determined group was Robert Hickman, who was attempting to free himself, along with his family and neighbors, from enslavement on a plantation in Boone County, Missouri. Hickman, a preacher who could both read and write, had seen newspaper accounts of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 4 months earlier. Although the proclamation did not apply to Missouri because it was under Union control, this news nonetheless inspired him to begin making plans to escape north. The Hickman party aimed to reach free soil by way of the river, which was by then safely patrolled by the Union Army. They embarked under cover of darkness on the moonless night of May 3rd, but because their makeshift craft was not equipped with sails or oars, they drifted for a day in the wrong direction before encountering the Northerner. Seeing the floundering party with so many children aboard, Captain Woods asked if they needed assistance. Sympathetic to their plight and knowing that the strains of the Civil War had left Missouri with a labor shortage, Woods ordered the raft to be securely tied to the steamboat and offered to take them as far as his final destination. Neither Woods nor Hickman anticipated the vitriol that awaited them on May 5th. When the Northerner approached the levee in Lowertown on the outskirts of St. Paul, as local dock workers, mostly Irish, caught sight of the self-emancipated African Americans, commonly referred to as contraband by whites, on the trailing raft, they became increasingly agitated, seeing them as competition for jobs. As word spread, a threatening crowd gathered on the levee. The commotion was so great that St. Paul police arrived on the scene. But after assessing the situation, they sided with the mob and threatened to arrest not the Irish rabble-rousers, but the black asylum seekers, should they disembark. Captain Woods ordered the boat with its trailing raft to steam on to Fort Snelling. There, Hickman and his party came ashore without incident on May 5th. But they were met with an unexpected sight. Hundreds of disheveled Native Americans were huddled together, forcibly assembled near the docks. The desperate and anxious crowd they encountered were part of an original group numbering more than 1,600, mostly women, children, and elderly Dakota people who had been held under armed guard all winter, following the Dakota War of the year before, in a miserable encampment in a lowland area below Fort Snelling. Unbeknownst to them, Minnesota government officials and military leaders were awaiting the spring thaw that would allow for their mass deportation downriver from their ancestral homes to a bleak reservation in the Nebraska Territory. By the time the ice finally melted and the river levels rose, hundreds had died. A group of 770 Dakota people had been shipped off the day before on another steamer, the Davenport. Having set the Hickman party safely ashore and unloaded the wagons and supplies for the military fort, Captain Woods ordered preparations to receive his next cargo. 547 Dakota people, whom he was transporting for the fee of $25 per head plus 10 cents a day for sustenance. Soldiers from Fort Snelling herded the ragtag remnant aboard the Northerner like so many cattle, as one observer put it. As they pulled away, a local minister's wife remarked, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from man." Neither Hickman and his companions nor the Dakota people would have had the perspective to realize that they were witnessing the momentous final chapter of both chattel slavery in the U.S. and Indian removal in Minnesota. They would not have grasped the paradox the two groups represented that afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi River. That the end of bondage for Hickman's band also marked the last vestige of sovereignty for the Dakota people. And they would certainly have been unaware that in the closing weeks of 1862, just 5 months earlier, President Lincoln was simultaneously considering two documents that would dramatically change the fates of each group: a warrant for the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and the Emancipation Proclamation. The encounter on May 5th, 1863, contains multiple narrative streams, each of which tells a different story about America. The question is, which do we follow? Do we tell the story of Fort Snelling, the military outpost established to protect the westward expansion of settler colonialism? Do we embark back down the Mississippi River to Missouri and the story of enslaved Africans in the South? Do we push upriver from St. Paul to its headwaters and stories of indigenous peoples populating this land for millennia? Or do we portage east and across the larger waters connected to the homelands of Europeans who first set foot on these shores just a few hundred years ago? Each narrative pushes back to a different beginning. So I kind of set the stage with that story, and then really the next section of the chapter there is entitled America's Identity Crisis. And I talk about that setting as an unresolved tension in our history that we are still fighting to sort out today. And I think if I can put it historically as possible, it really is this. And I've come to realize, as you just heard, like my day job, I spend a lot of time tracking American attitudes. At Public Religion Research, we interview 100,000 Americans a year on a whole range of public policy, opinions, attitudes about all kinds of stuff. And what I've become convinced of is really over the last decade in particular, as much as we talk about our divisions, they are less and less about policy. They are more and more about identity. And the questions really are not like who supports, allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry, or who is for and against abortion, or, goodness knows, economic policy. They are more and more about the question of who are real Americans. Who is truly American? Who counts? Who doesn't count? And I think that's the question that is really being put before us in even sharper relief than certainly it's ever been put in my lifetime. And if we kind of hearken back to this history and realize this is the question, in fact, that has been with us from the beginning. And I put it this way, and I'll end with this, that the question I think that is still before us, that has always been for us, and there's always been these two conflicting, mutually exclusive traditions, is this. Is this country a promised land that's divinely ordained for the use and benefit of European Christians? Or are we a pluralistic democracy? That, I think, is the question that is the most kind of starkly before us today. So I will stop there and see kind of where we want to go.
Thank you. Who has a question for Dr. Jones? Or a comment?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
My question has to do, is twofold. Number one, we did have Amanda Tyler here, as you said, and heard her speak about Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And the difference between Christian nationalism and following the teachings of Jesus. And so, would you expand a little bit, maybe from your perspective on that? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So in the paperback version of the Hidden Roots of White Supremacy came out in 2023, and there's a new paperback version that I got to write a little kind of afterward last fall, right? So it's fairly recent, the afterword in the paperback edition. And there I actually tie this long history that I'm telling here to Christian nationalism. And I'll kind of make it explicit. I mean, I think that it was sort of striking to me, for example, that if you look at that painting that I said is hanging in our Capitol right now, that underneath that banner, the oath of office was taken, right? And lawmakers walk every day through those halls, and that's quite striking to me. I think, because I think that is this explicit claim, right? This kind of cross being raised to justify, right, the taking of native lands, the whole settler colonial project, manifest destiny, all of that, right, is kind of part of that worldview. And when we look at, for example, and we measure Christian nationalism today, we measure it, and Amanda probably went through this, but we measure it through 4 or 5 questions, and they're questions like, the U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation, right? Do you agree or disagree? U.S. laws should be based on the Bible. If you're not Christian, you're not truly American. Like, it's those kinds of questions. And we kind of, when we measure people's agreement with that, what we find is that about 1 in 10 Americans completely agree with like all 5 of those questions, right? So that's where our 1 in 10 completely agree with all that. Another 2 in 10 don't completely agree, but they mostly agree. So when I'm kind of thinking about this, that means that about 3 in 10 Americans are essentially agreeing with that Christian nationalist worldview. So that's kind of where we are. Now that means that 2/3 of the country disagrees with that statement. That's important to say. Like, this is not a majority view in the country, but it has become the view of a couple of groups. Like, so if I look at the groups in which this is a majority, there are 2 groups that stand out. One are white evangelical Protestants. 2/3 of that group qualify as Christian nationalists today, right? So those are my people, right? The evangelicals, Southern Baptists are the largest representative of that. The other group where this has taken hold are self-identified Republicans. 54% of self-identified Republicans today qualify as Christian nationalists. And one of the challenges that we're facing, kind of thinking about the demographics, is that even as the country has become more diverse, our two political parties have sorted themselves along ethnic and religious lines. And so that's been quite startling. So I mentioned that today, for example, in the country is 41% white and Christian. The Republican Party is 70% white and Christian. The Democratic Party is 25% white and Christian at the national level, right? So this is setting up kind of this big conflict, right? That we essentially have now, one party that has been, that is demographically speaking, supermajority white and Christian, and that has embraced this notion that the country is here for their benefit fairly exclusively. And we can see that even when we add in like a statement, we put in a survey statement that's like very explicitly about white Christian nationalism, and it was just, do you agree that the U.S. was designated by God to be a promised land for European Christians? Like, put it just like that. And even when we put it like that, we find that about those same numbers, it's majorities of Republicans, majorities of white evangelical Protestants saying, yep, that's actually what I think. And I think that's kind of at the heart of what we're wrestling with today.
Ray.
But one more thing on that, just while you're going there, but that is to say that like the term Christian nationalism is kind of new. It's maybe 5-6 years old in our kind of parlance. But the idea of it is the version that landed on that's the version of Christianity that landed on our shores, right? So it's very, very old. It's in fact older than a version of Christianity that supports a pluralistic democracy. Yeah.
I've watched the money power loot my country since 1980. I've watched the middle class weakened. I've watched our country deindustrialized, commanded by a bunch of financiers. I've seen identity politics as a bait and switch to prevent us from being aware of the class war that's being waged against working and middle class people. Don't you think that your emphasis on identity politics plays into the hand of the money power?
No, I don't think so at all, actually. So you're right to say the economics is clearly playing a role here. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, you look at, I spent some time in the Midwest, in the fall, and, even the term Rust Belt, right, that we have to use, right, that is describing a hollowing out, right, of manufacturing jobs, and absolutely, you could see, the whole sense of like union membership, union jobs, all down, right, over the past 50 years especially. All of that's taken a real toll. The concentration of wealth at the top looks like it did during the Gilded Age, right? I don't have the exact number, but we're basically back to the Gilded Age, concentration of wealth at the top, spread very thin. So it's not really like upper class, middle class. It's like the top 1% and then sort of everybody else in very different places. All that's exactly right. When we've actually done analysis on this among white working class folks especially, what we find is that the kind of support for Christian nationalism is connected to that for sure, but it's not the explanatory factor. So when we look at, for example, we did an analysis to see what's driving support for Donald Trump, right, in 2016 and in 2020. And we just actually redid this analysis and released it last week. So if you want to look at it, it's up on our website at prri.org. And what we basically find is that the support for this movement, and I really do think this movement is not just a partisan movement. I mean, it's more of a cultural movement. The support for the kind of MAGA movement that we're seeing in the country is essentially partly driven by economics, but when we do the analysis and we kind of control for a whole bunch of things, it's actually 2 parts cultural grievance and 1 part economic grievance. So if you're making a recipe for it, the cultural grievance part is actually more powerful than the economic grievance part. And I think, like, my job, I think, is to highlight that and help us be as clear as we can be about what the dynamics are and what is driving it. So absolutely, the economic concerns are real. The economic, kind of distress is real. That was also really clear in all the pre-election surveys. The economic distress in the country across the board was just super high. It was highest among Latinos actually in the last election, where we could see it in public opinion data. So it's absolutely there. But I think if we're going to understand what's happening to us, and I agree there's a lot of weird bait and switch stuff going, but if we're going to understand what's happening to us, we've got to understand, I think, what's driving, I think, people. And our best analysis tells us that the thing that's driving people is kind of two parts kind of cultural grievance and kind of one part economic grievance.
Over here.
Okay, the irony to me with a lot of this is people originally came to this country, the Europeans, because of religious persecution. That said, I'm probably totally wrong about this, but the word Christianity isn't even in the Constitution. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. So is there a question? Is that it? That's just a yes or no question? Yeah, so that's correct. Let me tell you what is in the Constitution. Is the disenfranchisement of indigenous people, where they are not counted for representation. What is in the Constitution is the disenfranchisement of people of African descent, where they are actually counted as 3/5 of a person for representation, but then only for the empowerment of their owners, right? For the white owners. Like those things are in the Constitution there, and of course the Declaration of Independence does make reference to God, right? And that's the kind of source of rights in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence also talks about indigenous people as merciless savages, right? In the Declaration of Independence there, and so like we've got the Declaration of Independence also complains that the King of England is inciting slave rebellions against good white slave-owning colonists, right? And so this view, right, of kind of white over non-white, and like underneath it all is the strongest justifications for that are in fact Christian, that are kind of in the culture, in the sermons, and in this justification for it. And one thing I outline in the book is the strongest roots for this is this thing called the doctrine of discovery. As a Christian doctrine that kind of runs through, and in fact, all of our land kind of claims here in the U.S. are actually based on this. It's a 15th century Christian doctrine that goes all the way back to Columbus and the kind of conquest by Spain early on, and it is an edict from the Pope, right, that basically says, and because Columbus on his second voyage goes back and he asks for a bunch of ships and all that stuff, but he also asked the church for moral permission for his next voyage. At the time, there's no Protestants in the world, so there's no Anglicans, there's no Protestants. Everyone in Western Europe is under the authority of the Catholic Church. And so this is an appeal basically to the closest thing to international law and to all of the Catholic Church, all of Christendom in Western Europe. And he asked for this, and the Pope essentially grants it to him with the logic, and he says, look, if these people that you've encountered in these new lands are not Christian, and of course he knew they weren't, then you have the right to take their lands, steal their goods, and in this document from the hand of the Pope, and again, this is all of Western Christendom that's under this authority, it even spells out in this document, and that you have the right to submit their persons to perpetual slavery, right? That's a Christian stamp of approval, like that goes all the way back, like from the very beginning. And I spend a lot of time in the book kind of spelling out that and how that comes forward into U.S. law and actually U.S. case law that's about ownership rights is all rooted actually in that Christian doctrine. The Episcopal Church, by the way, has issued an official apology for its role in its complicity in the doctrine of discovery there. So like your denomination has sort of taken some steps, I think, of really recognizing its role and trying to kind of make things right in that regard.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right here.
So something the small part of White Too Long that really stood out to me that you haven't talked about the last couple of days, the idea of individual relationship with Jesus, or the fact that like Americans feel like individual liberty is important, individual accomplishments are important. Yeah. That sort of robs us of a toolkit of an ability to see systemic problems and puts it at a disadvantage thinking about racism in particular. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that idea.
Absolutely. So I grew up Southern Baptist, right? And I was also that kid who was at church like 5 days a week, literally. That's kind of what you did as a Southern Baptist in Mississippi if you were a good church member. And the thing I remember like strikingly is that this constant emphasis on personal sin. Like, so in every service, right, there was an opportunity for you to come down and rededicate your life to Jesus, and it was all about like personal sin. And so sin was very much with us and this idea, but it was also very inward, and it was about kind of, things like, did I lie? Did I lust? Did I, like these kind of like, did I steal? Like these little, did I cheat on that test? Like those kinds of things. It was never outward, right? And so like this most striking contradiction I mentioned yesterday was, so Jackson Public Schools, where I was in public school, drug its feet on desegregating for 22 years. So Brown v. Board of Education is 1954. Our public schools don't get desegregated until 1976, when I'm in third grade. Right, so that's when that happens. And what did our church have to say about the sin of racism, the sin of segregation? Like, absolutely nothing. Right? I don't remember not a single sermon, not a single word, not a peep about that. Either before, during, or after that event. So here's this tumultuous thing turning our social world, upside down in many ways. First black teachers, first black classmates, just utter crickets from the church on that. And I'm a little bit, and I should say I'm indebted to, there's a sociologist named Ann Swidler who talks about the kind of cultural toolkits that we use to kind of embrace. So when we're faced with problems, we all are handed, in her work, which I think is really helpful, we all kind of have, you think of it as a metaphor, a toolkit. We all have certain tools we can reach for to address problems that we're, and one of the things that she and then Michael Emerson, some of you may know his work, Divided by Race, picks that up for white evangelicals in particular, that we have such individualistic notions about sin. Our theology, our theological toolkit, only gives us tools to address individual sin. It just didn't give us any tools, no lenses, no hammer, no nail, no saws to kind of address or even see social sin or structural injustice in the world. And so we're literally kind of flying blind, and even when we see it, we don't have anything to put our hands on to deal with it. And I think that was so powerful to me when I first kind of read that. So why I ended up writing about it in the book, is that in a world that's obsessed with sexual sin and dishonesty and even personal racism, that all of that can happen without ever considering that we were living in a redlined, whites-only neighborhood, defending a whites-only public school, right? Like all of that at the same time was possible because of this kind of disconnect. Yeah.
Got time for one or two more.
Well, you mentioned 2/3 of the concerns were cultural and 1/3 economic. To me, that documents the success of the money power with their identity politics divide and conquer strategy. But I'm looking at Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, nor bond, nor free, nor male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And I like that you quoted the Declaration of Independence. It seems that all historically conditioned documents like the Bible or the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, like in the Declaration of Independence, so we have the King of England raising up the savages against us, so that's a very reactionary way of thinking. But the beginning of the Declaration is kind of like this verse out of Galatians where it talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So isn't the way out of all this morass, and you were a voice to help guide us out of that, is to look at the seed, key ideas that perhaps outgrow and burst out the intellectual flower pots, the historical packaging in which they are placed before us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I should be very clear that we're going to have a real opportunity to do that in 2026, right? We're going to have the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I'm going to tell you now, there's going to be a huge fight over what that document means next year. And absolutely, I think the task is to what did they get right and what did they not get right, right? And to put all of our efforts into saying, yeah, these principles, right? These are the things that they got right, and these are the things that we want to bring forward, right? And to, Jefferson talked about, the kind of idea that every generation's got to kind of recreate the republic. We really do have to do that work. We can't just kind of sit back because the worst of our forces or worst of our instincts will take hold if all the good people sit back. But we've got to kind of lean in, I think, and say, like, this is the story of who we are. This is the story of where we want to be or who we want to be in this country. And I think that goes for, both the Bible and for, documents like the. So, yes, absolutely to that. One just I think I can't resist mentioning, because you read that verse out of Galatians, is that I mentioned yesterday the kind of damage that this kind of exclusivist, white supremacist worldview has done to Christianity. Some of the most extreme versions of it meant that parts of the Bible had to be literally excised in order to kind of carry on. And so that verse, for example, there's a Bible that Fisk University has in its collection that's called the nickname, the kind of slave owner's Bible, right? And it was printed in England for use by enslavers with enslaved people in the British West Indies. And they literally went through the Bible and took out every mention of freedom, of slaves being set free. So they included the book of Exodus. Even they kept the name Exodus, which means leaving. And they included the enslavement of the Israelites, but they did not include their being set free. They just lopped that out of the book of Exodus. They included Ephesians, slaves obey your masters, but they did not include that thing in Christ. There is no Jew, no Greek, no slave, nor free. They just cut that out, right? And I always find that the most extreme example of like the literal violence that gets done to the text and to the to a tradition by this kind of prior commitment. But there's lots of other subtle ways where that it happens as well. But I think that's the work, is to kind of pull out the best of it. Yeah.
Last one right here.
Yep.
So I am not like a child, like middle school, but I'm 24, so I'm still pretty young. And I'm thankful that I grew up in a position that I was surrounded by people that supported diversity of self and also of the community. But what would be your advice to someone that's younger that didn't necessarily, like I wasn't in school when the schools were desegregated or anything like that. I grew up very much, I was born in 2000. And so there's a big difference in that. But what would be your advice to kind of support and promote that as a white person, as a white male, especially in the U.S.? That's kind of the easiest that it can be. Yeah. And so what would be your advice for me or for people like me in helping to support this?
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. And I say that not just to you personally, right? But I mean, one of the challenges is that if you look at virtually every majority white Christian denomination in the country, the median age is like me or older, right? So I'm 56, and the median age is about that, 56, 57, and it's creeping up because there are fewer and fewer young people sort of connected. So one thing you could do is, because I think the real, the kind of effervescence and livelihood and health of institutions that survive over generations is that each new generation comes in, and each generation typically does have a clearer vision on some things than the previous generation had, right? And that renewal is really important. I think that generational renewal, because, all of us in here, whatever age you are, you could probably remember something that your generation challenged the previous one on, right? That you saw differently than the previous one did, whether it's like women in ministry, women in the workforce, whether it's LGBTQ people, whether it's like, there were all these kind of things that the next generation saw differently, right, than the previous one did. So lending the rest of us your vision, I think, is really important, right? Because there'll be some things that you guys just aren't hung up on that the rest of us are struggling with, right? And, seeing that actually makes a huge dent. I think there are probably many people in here. I guarantee you there are plenty, just to give you one example, there are plenty of grandparents, right, who have different views on race, who have different views on sexual ethics, because they've talked to their grandchildren, right? And that's just real. That happens. And so I would say, like, stay here, stay in the fight, stay in the conversation, because that fresh lens, I think, is something we all are going to need. So,
Let's say thank you to Dr. Jones. I hope it won't surprise you to hear that it's not an accident that Dr. Jones is with us, that Amanda Tyler was with us a few weeks ago. This is a representation of hard work that's been going on in this parish and in the wider community, not just for the last few months, but for the last few years. If you're interested in this, if you want to be a part of this, if you want to find ways to lend your voice and your perspective to the work of racial healing, there are lots of ways to do that. One of those is to become a part of our Becoming Beloved community. They meet on the first and third Wednesdays of the month in the evening. They also do work throughout the year other than that. Also, this is a representation of our partnership with the Zacchaeus Foundation, who does work not only with St. Paul's, but with other churches and individuals and organizations in the community. So stay tuned. There are lots of ways for us to be a part of this work, and I'm really glad to be a part of a church and a wider community that is committed to it. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon.
All right.